One of the most interesting interviews that I had at Gamescom was talking about Crowfall. For those who don't know, Crowfall is an MMORPG which is based on player cooperation and conflict across decisive and finite campaigns. The Eternal Kingdoms are player-created cities and hubs where players who rise to power can rule as they see fit, and each campaign wields a huge, procedurally generated map with its own set of victory conditions. It's an incredibly ambitious MMORPG, there's nothing else like it on the market, and it sort of encourages the modding community in ways that you've never seen before. And that was really the crux of our roundtable conversation, because Crowfall is currently in pre-alpha, and there was just recently a massive 5.7 update, which we briefly touched on, as well as the upcoming 5.8 discussion. But I wanted to know more about ArtCraft Studios' background. I wanted to know about what went into the development process of Crowfall. This isn't like your conventional World of Warcraft Elder Scrolls Online. This is something completely separate and different. It's a really fascinating story and one that I hope you really enjoy listening to. So I got to speak to J.Todd Coleman, who is the creative director at ArtCraft Studios, and Gordon Walton, who is the executive producer at ArtCraft Studios. So if you enjoyed this interview, please consider giving us a subscribe. If you want to know anything more about Crowfall, please let us know in the comment section below. That's enough for me. Here we go.
How much has the ambition of the project changed since your initial idea of what Crowfall was to what it is now?
Really only we initially were going to do archetypes.
Like a MOBA. Right. So you didn't get to choose. Yeah, you didn't get to say I want a Centaur Knight versus Centaur Cleric. It was like, no, you're going to be a Centaur Cleric. That's your only option. You look like this.
Yeah.
So that was the biggest, most significant change that we've made. The core vision hasn't fundamentally changed since we started. Now, we have done more fundraising than we expected, and that's resulted in a better game overall. Like, just in general, I think that the overall quality of the game looks better, it plays better, but the vision hasn't changed since we started. And we can go back now and actually watch the Kickstarter video and be like, yeah, pretty much, that's the game we've built. So, it's not quite done yet, but we're getting very close.
I mean, it's always then when you're implementing stuff, you go, okay, that sounded awesome, but it's really not quite that.
Yeah.
That's in fact actually the only thing I think that has dropped out from when we started. Was we originally thought that we would do full voxel support like Minecraft, and it just didn't. We played with it, we actually spent a fair amount of time on it, it didn't add enough. So we took all the other pieces that we wanted, like destruction of walls, harvesting of all the trees and all the rocks, tunneling underneath walls for Ganetians. We made up feature list and said, okay, rather than assuming that that's the technology that we need to get there, let's iterate all the things that we want. And if we can get there a different way, that's smarter and leads to a better and more performant game, we'll do that. So, that's kind of normal. What's weird is that players see this part of the development process. This is to developers, I think Warren Spector calls it finding the fun. It's like it's figuring out what it needs to be. I might have attributed that to Warren. It may be somebody else's quote, but you know, the idea that you have a vision in mind of what you want the game to be when you start, but inevitably, unless you're cloning somebody else's game, you never quite end up there. You end up similar, but a little different, just because that's the way development works. It's a normal, natural part of the process. Players don't usually see that. They see the tail end where it's like, well, here's where we ended up, and they just assume that that's where you set out, and that's not actually always the case. In fact, I'd say it's almost never the case. It's usual that you have a vague idea and you refine it over time as you get there. New things that you never thought would be fun or worth exploring pop up. New opportunities to explore pop up in development, and you want to explore some of those. And other things that you thought would be easy or that you thought would be worthwhile turn out to be dead limbs that you need to trim off the tree for the overall tree to be healthy. So it's fascinating, actually, that the whole process of designing and building a game in front of and with a crowd. I could easily give a talk on what like the differences in terms of that versus traditional development, because it really is fascinating how it has its own challenges, but it also has some massive benefits that I think are really fascinating.
Well, I think you mentioned at the beginning how you basically have the luxury to make the game you want to make now, as opposed to having, do you want this now or do you want it to be great?
That is absolutely part of it.
Is it?
Yeah.
Like, in a weird way, it almost feels like now you started out making the game you wanted to make, but now you're also making the game the players want you to make.
Right.
And it's kind of interesting that, you know, I guess I'm just thinking, does that ever become a challenge? And I guess it hasn't, because you still feel great about it. But it's interesting because now you have a different master. I mean, it's kind of like...
Yeah, it is.
And interestingly, I suppose you're linking in as well because you're now licensing your engine outwards. So are you now making the game that developers want to make you to make?
Well, so the engine is an interesting new wrinkle to it, but we hired we went and hired a separate team of engineers specifically to, there's not a word, but I'll pretend it as engineify the code base, because the initial customer that we brought in actually was well aware that it was not an engine. It was Crowfall, the base. So we specifically sat down and talked to them at the beginning and said, what game are you building? We made sure that it wasn't Crowfall, right? They saw benefits beyond, and furthermore, it was a team of
easiest game to build.
Well, yeah, we'll talk more later this year about who that team is and what they're doing and all that stuff. And I think it's super exciting. But yeah, I feel like this whole process of having the users engaged at a fundamental level, it's almost like we've been able to take and harness the power of a modding community and bring it internally. And I think that's underestimated in terms of power, right? There have been some significant game ideas that have actually grown out of the modding communities, including maybe you've heard of League of Legends. I don't know, a little bit. Also, there's this other weird kind of battlegrounds kind of thing that's been, I've heard kids are into, you know? So anyway, I mean, some of the biggest successes that we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years have actually been mods that have bubbled to the top, because if you think about a modding community, it's kind of a genetic algorithm of trying out game ideas, and the really good ones float to the top. So what we've done is kind of harness the power of our 50,000 backers and 300,000 fans, and we go to them constantly and discuss, like, hey, what do you think would be cool here? And hey, why do you think this idea, it all sounded good on paper, but it's not, or sounded good on the forums, but it's not really working. And I literally go and treat them like an adjunct to our design team. Like, I will take new ideas and vet them, I'll dredge through and look for solutions. And there's a handful of the people that are on our forums that I can tell you right now are at least as, I would put them at a senior designer or lead designer level in terms of their instincts, even though they don't do it professionally. They're just spot on. They have great instincts. So that's awesome, right?
And I suppose, you potentially have just created a whole new subgenre by having modifications within an MMO.
Right.
Because that's not something that has existed previously. And where does that go?
Well, you know, it's funny, the things that we're doing now do have some correlations. They just are pre-World of Warcraft. So back before WoW convinced everyone, I mean, I'll pause for a second. WoW convinced everyone that there was one right way to make an MMO. If you want to make $1 billion with the MMO, you're going to make it WoW with blank. You can fill in the blank with something else that you think will be a marketing appeal, but at the end of the day, the game that people with money wanted you to make was the thing that was most likely to make you WoW money, and that's remake WoW. Before WoW, that wasn't the case, right? We had crazy, very interesting design ideas that were spawning up, right? Like Star Wars Galaxies, fundamentally different model than World of Warcraft. Ultima Online, Shadowbane, Dark Age of Camelot, right? Which had some WoW, but also had some of the foundational pieces of WoW or Daikumud, but then had also Realm versus Realm on top of it to add a whole lot of interesting spice to it. So we saw a lot of experimentation pre-WoW. It's just the post-WoW environment. We sort of all trimmed all of the other branches of the evolutionary tree. So what we're trying to do now, and actually what you're seeing now, not just from us, but some of the other indie MMOs that are out there. I shouldn't use the word indie. I hate that. It's independent, I should say. It robs from the real indies when people like us say we're indie. Independent MMOs out there, you're seeing some of that level of experimentation come back, and it's really awesome because it's healthy. Right? That's where new undiscovered country, right? That's where the cool stuff is found. It's also where you get punched with arrows and you bleed out, bit by poisonous snakes. But it's still where the cool stuff happens, one way or the other.
Have you got any pieces of content or features you've not announced yet that are probably going to be making the final launch whenever that happens? And what does your post-launch roadmap look like?
The great thing about the model of game we've done, right, is that each of the campaigns is a chance for us to try out a radical new, different idea. So, you know, we'll have campaigns that come up that are 3-faction, light on death penalty, very, very interconnected, relatively more casual, and I hate to use that word, but relatively safer kind of environments. And then we're going to have hardcore dregs environments that are full-on guild versus guild, full loot. like, deathmatch style environments. So right there, we've created an experimentation platform that's fantastic because every campaign is a fresh start, and we get to randomly generate the worlds. We can try out interesting stuff like this is an elf versus dwarf only campaign. You can't come in unless you're one of those two races.
Yeah.
This is a high magic or low magic campaign. This campaign is really resource rich, or this campaign has no ore at all. There's no metal. That would just be interesting, right? So the fact that our game is engineered and architected the way it is gives me as a designer an experimentation platform that you usually don't get. Typically with an MMO launch, you've got one shot at launch to make your decision of how to set your design knobs, and you better hope they like it, because if they don't, you're dead. And in this case, we actually, every new campaign is another opportunity. So as a designer, like that's the thing that I'm most excited about, is it gives me a chance to actually experiment. And that's what we all want to do, right? We want to try stuff out. And I love that about our backer community now, is they've embraced that. They're into the idea of experimentation. So even if they don't like a particular campaign that we test, they're like, that's fine, I'll just wait a month or so, and I know the next one that's going to come out will be one of my life. So that's really cool.
Yeah.
So I don't have a specific answer for you of what is the next set of features that we're going to do. All I can say is we're going to be able to do it, and it's going to be awesome because I'll be able to come up with new stuff, and we'll be able to go through the forums and talk to our fans and let them come up with stuff. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if we have a couple that are like, hey, this guy had a great idea, we're going to try his campaign out. It ain't
like
work for us.
Spotify. I mean, I just read an article on Spotify, and one of the things the founder said was, after Spotify was going, they saw one of their users started creating favorites list, but it was like my favorite I have a headache playlist, my favorite stress relieving playlist. So it wasn't like my favorite rock and roll playlist, my favorite whatever rhythm and blues, but it was completely mood based, and they're like, oh my god, that's so smart. And then they saw a lot of users jumping on board with those kinds of playlists, like my I'm traveling to Seattle playlist, and they ultimately bought that guy's little company that he was using to make those algorithms and pull those kinds of songs together. But they said, we just took something that we saw our users doing, and we just embraced it and literally made it part of our service. And I mean, that's kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I hope, we're lucky enough to be able to do all the ways we're giving people emergent behavior and opportunities to take the game right or left. And, we're sort of teeing that up, even more than Spotify. I feel like just the mechanism you described is we're really building a game that has that opportunistic window in it.
Yeah, that experimentation is it's part of the DNA of the game, and that's really cool.
Yeah. So you're steering the ship. You've given everyone the tools, and you're steering the ship.
Pretty much, yeah. So the other thing I will say is that we just had our most recent version come out. That's 5.7. It came out 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe. I don't know. I'm in a weird time bubble, time vortex right now because Gamescom's like that. But it just came out recently. The next version we have, 5.8, will actually be the first time we string together a real campaign, our first actual campaign.
Right.
So I look at it right now as an analogy. It's kind of like it's a soccer match, but there's no goals and no scoreboard. But otherwise, it's a completely playable game. Well, kind of. So this next version will have a scoreboard, we'll have a victory condition, and I expect that we'll see a pretty big resurgence of activity in the game as well. Not that we don't have activity now. We've got servers running in 3 different territories, and we're getting a lot of activity, but I think that we'll start to see a whole new level of activity once we give people something they can actually win. And that's going to be coming here between now and the end of the year. It's coming around the corner.
Awesome.
Our first throne war that will be won
Our first throne war that will actually be won and lost. Yep.
Well, it looks fantastic, and I've really enjoyed just because I came just not really knowing anything about Crowfall, and I think I'm very sold. So
cool.
Really
thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk me through it. It's been great.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you for coming.